My name is Alan Devers. I'm from Headhunters Railway Museum in Enniskillen. Here we are at the railway car park. It's very uninspiring, this site, but at one time, believe it or not, this was Enniskillen's railway station. Enniskillen had a railway for just over 100 years. The first trains arrived in about 1854. About 3 or 4 years later, the railway arrived from Lisnaskea, Maguire's Bridge, Lisbon on into Enniskillen. Little Supermarket was the site of the goods store, which was where goods were unloaded from wagons and stored for safety and security inside. The station itself was big because you had 2 platforms. Where the curve of the footpath was roughly where the curve of the station platform was. Behind where that fence was the locomotive shed. It was a 2-bay shed. It held a considerable number of locomotives. There was a huge water tank because in those days steam locomotives required a lot of water and also a lot of coal. So Enniskillen was quite a hub. It was well connected. You could go basically anywhere from Enniskillen. You could go for a day trip to Bundoran on the train. You could go to Belfast for your shopping. You could go to Dublin. Later on, in fact, some of the Belfast stores offered people virtually free travel to Belfast. If you bought things in their store, they refunded your ticket money. Not only passengers travelled by train, but everything travelled by train. There was a considerable traffic in cattle from the west of Ireland. Cattle were reared in the west of Ireland, fattened up, then taken by train to Sligo and then on to Enniskillen. And each day a special train just of cattle wagons left Enniskillen and headed to Belfast or Londonderry, and those cattle were shipped to England to feed the cities of England. In the early morning, the newspapers arrived by train. The Royal Mail was carried by train. Even coffins came by train. Parcels, coal, everything came by train. The railways were very staff intensive because in the Victorian era, of course, labour was cheap. There had been mechanisation to a certain extent, but things were still manually operated. The signalling system, which was a safety system, required men. For example, to operate a signal box over a 24-hour period, you needed 3 different men just to do one shift right through the 24 hours. It was hard physical work quite often. Everything on the railway was heavy. The rails were heavy, the sleepers were heavy. The railwaymen always said everything was heavy except the pay. We're standing here on the Tempo Road. At this point, the railway would be coming in from Lisbon and from the south. This was also the route of the Bundoran Express. The Bundoran Express would run from Dublin to Bundoran every day from roughly Whit in May until the end of August. It brought pilgrims to Lough Derg and it also brought holiday makers to Bundoran. It was called an express simply because it didn't stop in Northern Ireland. To avoid customs formalities, once it got to Clones, it didn't stop until it got to Petticoat, so that it ran through Northern Ireland and Enniskillen in particular without stopping. The journey took about 5 hours from Dublin to Bundoran. At the moment we're standing on what used to be called the Pound Brae, a very old area of Enniskillen. Below us here is the Manager's Walk. It was provided from the railway station up to the Pound Brae as a shortcut for the upper echelons of the railway, the managers. For a nominal rent, they were given a key. They could use the key to open the gate and they had private access up to the Pound Brae. It was a shortcut to get home. The train would actually have run below us here at the bottom of the hill. There was a very tight curve here. It was the tightest curve on the Great Northern Railway. Trains could only travel at 15 miles an hour. It was such a sharp curve. And there was a double rail on the curve because of the sharpness of the bend. So trains were very limited in the speed. But anyway, trains wouldn't have been going fast here because virtually all trains stopped in Enniskillen apart from the Bundoran Express. At the moment we're beside the Irvinstown Road. At this point the railway is coming in from the Omagh direction and has passed Ballinamallard, and we're just on the outskirts of Enniskillen. At this point you'll notice that the railway is quite wide because the main line is here where the roadway is, or cycle path. On the other side here there were long sidings because this is where the cattle wagons were loaded up. There was a considerable traffic in livestock from Enniskillen to Belfast, Londonderry for shipping to England, like a farm on wheels. And I'm quite sure it was that, with all the smells associated with the country. At the moment we're out beside the Irvinstown Road, but in railway days this was a continuous embankment. This was the route out from Enniskillen towards Ballinamallard. We would soon cross over the first level crossing on the road to Chanter Hill, on out to Ballinamallard, and then out through Kilskeary, Trillick, Fintna and Omagh, and then on to Belfast. Behind me you can see what's left of the Weirs Bridge. This was a large bridge on the Sligo, Leitrim and Northern Counties Railway. The railway left Enniskillen Station, and by the time it got to the Weirs Bridge, this was officially bridge number 4 on the railway line. Grandly it was also known as the Killyhevlin Viaduct, or even the Erin Bridge. It was the biggest structure on the Sligo Leitrim Railway. It was a 467-foot long bridge. It has stone buttresses, which still exist, but the bulk of it was metal. It was built by Courtney, Stevens and Bailey, a Dublin firm, and was the railway's biggest landmark. But even from the early days it had a 5-mile-an-hour speed limit on it. Locals would often use it on a Sunday as a walk, so it was quite well known as a local walkway. There were 1 or 2 accidents over the years. One or two people got killed because they got in the road of trains. But this was the main highway, as it were, for cattle trains coming from the west of Ireland into Enniskillen. About 10 or 10:30, there would be a special cattle train each day called the Enniskillen Shipper, which took live cattle to Belfast, and they were then transported by boat to Liverpool or Birmingham, wherever it was, to feed the hungry masses of the English population. Here in the 1930s was Enniskillen outdoor swimming pool. It's now built over, but the Weirs Bridge was quite an attraction to Enniskillen. But even when the railways closed in 1957, it took a few years before the bridge was sold because nobody came forward to claim the scrap. But eventually in the 60s, the metal parts of the bridge were dismantled. So today we're only left with the stone abutments. It was a railway run on a shoestring. It was never a particularly prosperous concern, but it still managed to survive until 1957 and became the last independent railway in the British Isles, simply because as it crossed the border, if it had been entirely in the south of Ireland, it would have become part of the Great Southern Railways, but because it crossed into Northern Ireland for about 11 miles, it continued on its independent way for many years.